Well, of course, this evening we come to the remarkable episode in David's life. In fact, in many ways, one of the more remarkable episodes in Scripture. The day a woman single-handedly stopped an army, restraining David and stopping him from committing an act which would have been a grievous and regrettable sin. An offence so serious, in fact, that it would have plagued him and been a grief of heart to him for the rest of his life. Without a shadow of a doubt, this is the story of a virtuous woman, a woman of industry, of intelligence, of marvellous spiritual perception. This, of course, is the story of Abigail, the wife of Nabal, which we find before us in 1 Samuel chapter 25. And if you come with me to 1 Samuel 25 verse 1, this is how the story begins. It tells us in the first verse of the chapter that Samuel died, and all the Israelites were gathered together and lamented him and buried him in his house at Ramah. And David arose and went down into the wilderness of Paran. And it's difficult to appreciate, I think, just how David might have felt at the death of Samuel. I mean, Samuel in many ways was his father in the truth, wasn't he? Way back in chapter 16, anointed him. And it had been an enormous tower of strength to Samuel, enormous tower of strength to David as David fled from Saul those many years in the wilderness. Samuel was the one who had given David a vision of the truth that David never even dreamed of, who in his early days, Samuel's that is, early days, began to collect money for the temple that would be built way distantly in the future, many years after his death, who discussed with David the appointment of singers and Levites when David's kingdom was finally established. All of these things Samuel spent talking to David about, and now he's dead. And not only is he dead, and with him the great, perhaps, vision that he had given David, but Samuel also was the only person alive who had any break, if that could be what there was, on Saul's behaviour. I mean, Saul had a very different relationship to Samuel than what David had. Samuel loved him as a brother and as a father in the truth. Saul feared him as a superstitious spiritual figure that might be able to rain down evil upon him. But nevertheless, for good or ill, Samuel did have some control over Saul, and now even that was gone. What would the future hold? The last word, by the way, in the first verse of this chapter appears to be a translational error. It says that David went to the wilderness of Paran. Well, the wilderness of Paran is way down in the Sinai Peninsula. It appears more likely to be the wilderness of Maon, as you see in the second line of verse 2. There was a man in Maon. David has been already in the wilderness of Maon. You read that across the page in chapter 23 and verse 25, the very last couple of lines. Saul pursued David in the wilderness of Maon. So that appears to be, in fact, the more correct rendering of the last word of verse 1 of chapter 25. But you can imagine now what this means to David. In journeyings oft, in perils of robbers, in perils by my own countrymen, in perils by the heathen, in perils in the city, in perils in the wilderness, in perils among false brethren. This must be exactly what David will be feeling as now Samuel's dead. In weariness and painfulness, in watchings often, in hunger and thirst, in fastings often, in cold and nakedness, and beside all those things that are without, that which cometh upon me daily, the care of 600 angry men. So this was David's lot now, and he'd lost a mainstay of his spiritual support as the chapter opens. And I think the chapter opens probably with this little fact about Samuel, just so that we appreciate that David is not in an emotionally strong moment of his life. Because what happens next is going to show you some of the greatest ill judgment that David ever makes. And perhaps this is the reason why. Nevertheless, verse 2 introduces us to the next character of the story. There was a man in Maon whose possessions were in Carmel, The man was very great. He had 3,000 sheep and 1,000 goats, and he was shearing his sheep in Carmel. Almost as if now, in contrast to Samuel, the record introduces us to Nabal. Samuel was a great man of God. Nabal was a fool. As I mentioned, Samuel had already begun to lay aside money for the temple that would ultimately be built by Solomon. We find that out, by the way, in 1 Chronicles 26 and verse 28. Nabal, in contrast, was so obsessed with his finances that he couldn't even give to those in need. And the Proverbs speak about people like Nabal. Proverbs 13 verse 7 says, "There is that maketh himself rich, and yet hath nothing. There is that maketh himself poor, yet hath great riches." And that would be Samuel versus Nabal to a T, wouldn't it? Well, he has this property in Carmel. He lives in Maon. There was a man in Maon who had possessions in Carmel. So, now this is not Mount Carmel, this is Carmel in Maon, in Judah, not up near Jezreel. So he's a wealthy landowner. He lives in Maon and he's got a ranch. The word possessions that he has in Maon, your margin tells you, is business. He's got business. And this business, of course, was agricultural. So he's got a ranch in Carmel. He's a wealthy man. And from David's vantage point on the hills of Maon, he would look over the valley and see spread out before him all Nabal's sheep, 3,000 of them, and 1,000 goats, it tells you in verse 2. All the livestock of Nabal. And Nabal's shearing his sheep, the verse tells us. Traditionally, of course, sheep shearing was a very joyful time of year. I mean, it was really bringing in the harvest, wasn't it? Not the harvest of crops, but the harvest of the sheep, the wool, the meat, whatever might have come. 2 Samuel 13 and verse 23 tells us that when Absalom was shearing his sheep, he invited Amnon to participate in the festivities, at which time he killed him. Now, Absalom had to plan carefully to get Amnon to come down and see him, because Amnon didn't trust Absalom one bit, particularly after the events earlier on in 2 Samuel 13. But such was the time of year and such was the custom of festivity and rejoicing when the harvest was brought in, that Absalom manages to trick Amnon and bring him down and take his life. The point is, it's a time of great rejoicing, and that was universal across the entire country. Well, the name of the man, verse 3, was Nabal. The name of his wife, Abigail. She was a woman of good understanding and of a beautiful countenance, but the man was churlish and evil in his doings, and he was of the house of Caleb. Abigail means my father's joy. She was of good understanding, the record tells us. That means she was intelligent. She was beautiful. The word beautiful literally means she was fair of eyes. It's the same word, this word beautiful, the same word you read of David in 1 Samuel 16 and verse 12, that he was ruddy and of a beautiful countenance. The point is, there was a look about her. There was a look about this girl. She was sharp. She was intuitive, and as you spoke to her, you could see her thinking in her eyes. There was something very striking about this girl. But she's married to a man who's her exact opposite. Nabal means fool. Probably not his original name, by the way. I mean, as a parent, why would you call your son Nabal? This is probably a corruption, a popular distortion of his name. But that is what people call him, including his wife. He's churlish, it says. The word means cruel or hard or rough. He's evil in his doings. That means he's mean and he's miserly. And he's of the house of Caleb. Almost as an afterthought, that's added to the end of the verse. What would that mean? Well, probably Nabal used this as one of his credentials. One of the most faithful men in Israel's history was this man Caleb, wasn't he? No doubt Nabal prided himself on the fact that his family had been in the truth for 8 or 10 generations. I mean, he was a 10th generation Christadelphian. His forebears were pioneers in the country. broke the place in. It's a hopeless dream, really, as far as Nabal was concerned. He was nothing like his forefather Caleb. In fact, the record paints a very detailed picture of just what sort of a man Nabal was. Verse 2 tells us that he was wealthy. Verse 3 tells us that he's cruel and miserly. Verse 11, he's greedy. Shall I take my bread and my water? He's greedy in verse 11. Anyone that even looked at his possessions sent him out of control and into a flying rage. In fact, verse 14 says he actually did fly into rage. Look at your margin at the last line of verse 14, if you've got an Oxford Bible. The young men came to him, David's young men, and he railed upon them. Margin, flew upon them. So he literally flies into a rage. I mean, he goes off his rocker if somebody was to take $10 from him. So much so that in verse 17, nobody could even talk to him. He's such a man of Belial, they say, you can't even speak to him. I mean, this man, he's lost the plot. Even his wife calls him a son of Belial. In verse 25, the word Belial means vanity or worthlessness. Even she says he's hopeless. And then, as if you needed anything more, to cap it off in verse 36, he drinks. He drinks. He's a drunkard. Well, the big question is, how on earth did this beautiful girl ever find herself married to a clown like this? What went wrong? Well, there are two possibilities, aren't there? The first possibility is that it was an arranged marriage. They're still common today in the Middle East. They were obviously common back in biblical times. That's one possibility, but I don't think the more likely possibility. I mean, you read many occasions in Scripture where people voluntarily marry each other. So by no means is it certain that this was an arranged marriage. Yes, possible, not probable. More likely, because of the parallels we'll see shortly, Nabal wasn't always like this. Psalm 52 verse 7 says this, Lo, this is the man that made this is the man that made not God his strength, but trusted in the abundance of his riches and strengthened himself in his wickedness. That, I believe, is an apt description of this man Nabal. He made not God his strength, but trusted in his riches and strengthened himself in his wickedness. And there's a mighty lesson here. He was probably a young lad, Nabal, with a decent head on his shoulders. I mean, he's quite smart. He's going to university. He's doing a course in finance. A professional sort of a degree, which is going to lead somewhere, not just excuse me if this is you, a course in English literature, which, well, perhaps you become a school teacher with that. Perhaps that does lead somewhere, but pick a course that leads nowhere. He's got something to him. And he's going to become a businessman. Comes from a good family, been in the truth 10 generations, who's had his good principles about him, a sensible sort of man, quite careful with his money, quite conservative in that regard, has potential. At maybe 22 years old, has enormous potential. And on the strength of that, he marries a good wife who also has great potential. The problem is that, as far as he was concerned, was as far as it went. Young men, think about this. If you're not serious, young brethren, if you're not serious Bible students, by the time you're in your early 20s, you're probably never going to be serious Bible students. Because in your early 20s, you really forge the kind of person you're going to be for the rest of your life. You're old enough to be independent, young enough to still have a lot of doors open to you. I mean, if you've only just started your career. So you're setting forth on the path that's going to become what you are for the rest of your life. And if Bible study is not a big part of that, then I'm going to suggest it probably never will be. And you could be doing finance at university or some sensible course, and a godly young sister marries you expecting that you're going to be a great leader of your family for the future. The problem is, you can't marry potential. And girls, if you're of that sort of age where you're looking at young lads who appear to have potential, let's see some runs on the board. Let's see if they can deliver anything. It may be that they're doing a sensible career. It may be that they're studious as far as study is concerned. It may be that all they really want to be is good businessmen. I mean, it's something worth thinking about, isn't it? And as a parent of girls, I think about that sort of thing. I mean, I don't know what I'd be doing if I lived here. I suppose if I lived in Texas, I'd be buying a shotgun and sitting on my rocking chair on the porch. I don't know. Is that what they... Oh, they probably don't do that in the truth. But it's worthy of considerable thought, because your girls can't just marry potential. And the same with young girls. Young girls are not going to be the ones in the ecclesia who are speakers. But how much work is done in ecclesial life off the platform? Even the speakers do at least as much work off the platform as they do on the platform. And you think about when the family comes along, just what the balance of power is in the family. The fact of the matter is this: the husband is responsible for the spiritual direction of the family. And he might set the standards of the family and the direction of the family, but without all question, the wife sets the tone of the family. And all the detail in the child rearing comes from the wife. Why? Well, because the kids get home at 3 or 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Dad doesn't get home till 6 p.m. in the afternoon. He might have left the house before the children go to school. And all the discussions on the peripheral subjects in the family are had with mum. If she doesn't have her head in the Bible, where are those discussions going to go? I happen to know from reading my Bible, from the life of Abraham, that the father of the faithful can have a son who never comes to the truth because of Hagar, I'm speaking, call her a wife, which is unfaithful. And another son who does come to the truth because of Sarah, a wife who is faithful. Same father, 2 boys, and Abraham loved them both. And look at the consequences. So, in fact, mum single-handedly can endorse or derail everything dad stands for. And so can dad, of course. There's no question, mum's got an enormous influence. She must be a Bible student as well. Well, what of Nabal? What would you say of him? Proverbs 30, verse 8. Give me neither riches nor poverty, but feed me with food convenient for me, lest I be full and deny thee and say, who is Yahweh? Or lest I be poor and steal and take the name of my God in vain. Really, as far as money is concerned, we can't live with it and we can't live without it. It's just one of those problems of life. The best path, therefore, is a middle course. Not too much, not too little, but enough for convenience and for security. And here's the issue of this chapter, of course. A rich man versus a poor man. Nabal versus David. One who says, who is Yahweh, because the whole world revolves around him, and the other who's in continual need, is about to raise an army to commit sin and blaspheme everything he stands for because he's poor. He's not going to steal, but he's about to take the name of God in vain. Verse 4. And David heard in the wilderness that Nabal did shear his sheep, and David sent out 10 young men. And David said unto the young men, get you up to Carmel and go to Nabal and greet him in my name. Young men. Now, listen, these young men aren't 10 years old. They're not just kids. They were soldiers in David's army. They'd come from the cave of Adullam where David had collected this band of men. But the point that the verse is making, I believe, is that they weren't the intimidating sort of soldiers in David's army. I mean, there were men, well, let's be frank, There were men in the cave of Adullam with David who you wouldn't send to the door of a stranger if you wanted to make a good impression. That's the fact of the matter, isn't it? How much food do you think David's 600 men would have required each day? His entire sustenance is coming from raids against the Philistines and the Canaanite tribes in southern Judah. That's where he's getting his livelihood from. And now he's done a good service to Nabal. Now, of course, there's no contract between Nabal and David, but it is the time of sheep shearing, and David is looking for recognition. Verse 7. I've heard, say these young men, that thou hast shearers. Now thy shepherds which were with us, we hurt them not, neither was there aught missing with them, unto them, all the while that we were in Carmel. Ask thy young men, they say, they will show thee. Wherefore let the young men, that is David's young men, find favour in thine eyes, for we come in a good day. Give, I pray thee, whatsoever cometh to thine hand unto thy servants and to thy son David. It was a fair request. As I say, under no circumstances could you say that Nabal has a legal obligation to David to pay wages. But David's efforts had saved Nabal a considerable sum of money. So you might say that there is a certain moral obligation here. This is a bumper harvest for Nabal because he hasn't lost, well, there hasn't been the normal shrinkage that Nabal might otherwise have seen any other year. In fact, it tells us in verse 16 of this chapter that David's men were a wall around Nabal's property. Nothing got in or out without their say-so. And here's Nabal now tallying up the increase of the year, counting the livestock, weighing the wool. David's come to Nabal, verse 8 says, in a good day, a day of rejoicing, a day of celebration, a day when men frankly ought to be generous for the blessings of God. And the young men deliver this message. And look at the answer, verse 10. Nabal answered David's servants and said, Who is David? And who is the son of Jesse? There be many servants nowadays that break away every man from his master. Who is David? Not that Nabal had never heard who David was. What he means by that statement is, who does David think he is? There be many servants, he says, nowadays that break away every man from his master, a reference to the fact that David was a servant of Saul who has run away. So this is quite a slur that Nabal makes. Verse 11, shall I then take my bread and my water and my flesh that I have killed for my shearers and give it to men whom I know not whence they be, he says. Oh, so there's a lot to talk about here, isn't there? At the very least Nabal could have done would be to have shown gratitude. Proverbs 3 verse 27. Withhold not good from them to whom it is due when it is in the power of thine hand to do it. Say not to thy neighbour, go and come again, and tomorrow I will give thee, when thou hast it by thee. And he's just harvested the sheep and he has it by him. A bumper crop like he's never seen before. Easy, you know. Easy in the heat of the moment to forget the source of all our blessings and to withhold what we should freely give. And we're not just talking about money. It may be that we don't have a lot of money personally, but we have time, we have advice. Our gift might be as simple as giving devout attention to a conversation from someone much younger than us. That might be the only reward they're looking for, is undivided attention. Some of these things are free to give, and sometimes we don't even give that. You know, I've found in my life, I don't have really young children anymore, but the fact of the matter is I might be in the study. I mean, I work from home, so I'm in the study for my job, I'm in the study, you know, I'm in the study all day, I'm in the study all night. Now, you're thinking of the rich fool of the New Testament, but you come back one page, or 2 pages, to chapter 22 and verse 8. Nabal's comment is strongly reminiscent of a comment by another man in the life of David. And in 1 Samuel 22 verse 8 it says this, Saul, Jonathan has helped has helped David rather, and David has escaped from Saul. And in verse 8 it tells us, that all of you have conspired against me, and there's none that showeth me that my son's made a league with the son of Jesse, and there's none of you that's sorry for me, or shows me that my servant is against me to lie in wait as at this day. It's all about me in this verse. Just as in verse 11 of chapter 25, it's all about I. You see? And there's an enormous parallel, in fact, between Nabal and Saul. They're both men who are completely consumed by themselves, and everything's always everyone else's fault. And no one has mercy on them. No one ever considers their feelings. Well, that was what Nabal's like. That was what Saul was like. Now, here's the interesting thing. 1 Samuel chapter 24, where Saul is chasing David, is an almost duplicate chapter to 1 Samuel chapter 26, where Saul is chasing David. In chapter 24, David's hiding in a cave at En-Gedi. Saul comes in, cuts off a piece of his robe. Saul leaves the cave, and David shouts to him from the top of a hill that he's spared his life. And in chapter 24 and verse 17, Saul says, "David, thou art more righteous than I." In chapter 26, a very, very similar thing happens. David, however, a different place, different time. This time David's hiding in the hill of Hachilah. Saul's camping down in the valley. We talked about it only a couple of nights ago. In the middle of the night, David and Abishai go down and they steal Saul's spear and his water bottle. And from the top of the hill, David shouts down to Saul again. And Saul shouts back up to David and says in chapter 26 and verse 21, "I've sinned, David. Return unto me, my son, David, my son." So you see these two parallel chapters, and sandwiched in between them is chapter 25, the story we're reading here, about David's deliverance of Nabal. Why? Can you see where this is heading? Chapter 24 and chapter 26 are parallels, and chapter 25 is sandwiched between them. Why is that? Well, here's why. Here's Nabal in comparison to Saul. Both of them, both Nabal and Saul, speak of David as their son. They both say, "Who's the son of Jesse?" They both say that they have rewarded David evil for good. Either Nabal says that or Abigail says that David has been rewarded evil for good. Saul said that too. Nabal and Saul were both about to be slain. Saul is a fool. Nabal means fool. Vengeance is God's, David says to his men, and Abigail says to David. Both of them, of course, have feasts fit for a king. Nabal's got a place in Carmel. Do you know, back in chapter 15 and verse 12, Saul built himself a pillar, a memorial in Carmel. He, in a manner of speaking, also had a place in Carmel. Me, you've just read it in verse 11 of this chapter. I. You've just read it in chapter 22 and verse 8. Both were smitten by God. God killed both of them, and both committed idolatry, inasmuch as Colossians 3 verse 5 says that covetousness is idolatry. What's the point? Well, so you've got now chapter 24, 25 and 26, all speaking about Saul or Nabal, who are copies of each other. What's the point, do you suppose, therefore, of chapter 25 being sandwiched between chapter 24 and chapter 26? Well, it's very simple. In chapter 24 and chapter 26, David would not touch Saul. He would not allow his men to take Saul's life because Saul was Yahweh's anointed. He's going to have no problem whatsoever taking Nabal's life in the middle of that sandwich in chapter 25. Doesn't have any issue whatsoever. So now it all depends who it is as to whether David would kill him or not. He's got an enormous double standard here, you see. Does God fight David's battles or does God not fight David's battles? When it comes to Saul, there's no hesitation. He's Yahweh's anointed. We won't touch him, and David controls his 600 men. But in the case of Nabal, who's done far less to him than Saul ever did to him, vengeance will be direct and it will be immediate. The problem is, you see, David's not all that committed to letting God fight his battles. He feels that if he kills Saul, God would punish him, and probably very swiftly, and probably true. But that if he kills Nabal, Nothing will happen. There'll be no consequences and the earth will be a better place. He doesn't really accept the fact that vengeance is God's. And he's got to learn to keep a principle because he loves God and not just because he fears the consequences. There would have been consequences if he killed Yahweh's anointed. He thinks there's going to be no consequence if he kills Nabal. Not true. Not true. But pause and just reflect upon the fact of verse 1 of this chapter. Samuel has died. David's not thinking perhaps as clearly as he ought to. I'm saying that might be a reason. That's not an excuse, but I think that's why the verse is there. This is a chapter somewhat out of character for David, and maybe there's a reason for that. But the fact remains, he's got a double standard. And he won't kill this man, but he will kill that man for far less. There's a problem there, you see. Well, Nabal said, who's David? Who's the son of Jesse? And in verse 12, David's men take that answer back home to David. Well, Nabal really didn't understand who he was talking to. Proverbs 18 verse 12 says, a fool hath no delight in understanding, but that his heart may discover itself. Have you ever talked to anybody like that? A fool has no delight in understanding, but that its heart may discover itself. This is someone who learns by talking out loud. They teach themselves things by talking out loud. Unbelievable. And they're impressed that they've learned something once they've had this conversation with themselves. Who's David? Some runaway slave scuttling about the back of the desert with 600 refugees? He thinks that sounds good. He's very brave as he stands in the door, the threshold of his house and shouts at these young men. Don't turn it up, but listen to this. This is who he's talking to. 1 Chronicles 12 verse 8 says that there were Gadites who separated themselves to David when he was in the wilderness. Men of might, men of war, fit for the battle, who could handle shield and buckler, whose faces were like the faces of lions, who were swift as roes upon the mountains. These were men that swam the Jordan in flood and put to flight soldiers on the other side. The least of them was already captain over 100 and the greatest over 1,000. Now go and tell them they're not worth a cracker and get off my property. Good luck with that. We know David's response in verse 13. David said unto his men, gird on every man his sword, and they girded on every man his sword. And David also girded on his sword, and there went up after David about 400 men, and 200 abode by the stuff that is their supplies. This is just what those men had been waiting for. They've been deprived of the execution of Saul in chapter 24 of 1 Samuel. They delivered Keilah in chapter 23, and they had been betrayed. These men are disgruntled men by very recent events. David is emotionally unstable by even more recent events. And now they've worked diligently for this landowner, asked for a small favour, and all they get is an insult. Well, David's furious. That's it, he says, get your swords on. Well, you can imagine Abishai and Joab saying, nothing like breathing fresh air. I mean, Joab's the man who fills his boots with blood. This would have been a pleasure to go and deal with this problem, and he wouldn't have even raised a sweat on someone like Joab. And there's 400 with him. Not one objection, by the way. Not one of David's 400 men thought better of this. Not one of David's ecclesia thought that this might be unwise and perhaps we should pause and consider and perhaps make it a matter of prayer to see perhaps what we should do. What kind of friends are they? Brothers and sisters, if I was going to go and take action against somebody like this, my true friends would be saying, don't even think about it. David doesn't appear to have friends like that, at least in this chapter. Not one protest. And David's about to commit a serious offence. Proverbs 14 verse 29. He that is slow to wrath is of great understanding, but he that is hasty of spirit exalteth folly. Exalteth folly. Proverbs 29 verse 20. Seest thou a man hasty in his words? There is more hope of a fool than him. Who's the fool now? In 1 Samuel 25. Who's the fool now? Amazing, isn't it? Well, while all that's happening, of course, there is pandemonium back at Nabal's house. He might have had no idea who he was talking to, but the servants knew very well who he was talking to. And they rush now and they tell Nabal's wife, you can't talk to Nabal, verse 17 says. So they go to Abigail, they tell her the whole story. Abigail, sit down, we've got a serious problem. These soldiers came. You've seen them around there on the perimeter. Yeah, that's right. They asked for food. Nabal flew into rage. He did what he normally does. Sit down, slow down. Okay. He insulted them. He shouted at them. But they were good to us. Day and night they were good to us. We've lost nothing. We would have lost dozens and dozens of sheep. Not one has gone. And there were hundreds of them, Abigail. There were hundreds of them all around us like this. And Abigail, you want to see them? We're done for. It's hopeless. They're going to come back. Well, Abigail took those words very, very seriously. In verse 18 it tells us she made haste. She took 200 loaves and 2 bottles of wine, 5 sheep ready dressed, 5 measures of parched corn, 100 clusters of raisins, 200 cakes of figs, and laid them on asses. That's not bad, lying around in the pantry. I mean, this is a family that's not short of money. There's an enormous harvest here. He's not just farming sheep, he's got a lot of money, this fellow. Notice, by the way, 2 bottles of wine. How far would that go amongst 400 men, or 600 men for that matter? Those are a little bit of icing on the top for David. She knows what wine can do to men. She's got one in her own house. So she gives enough to feed a small army and 2 bottles of wine for the boss. Not silly, is she? Not silly. Verse 19, she said to her servants, go on before me. Behold, I'll come after you. Where have you heard that before? David's coming with 400 men. Where have you heard that before? Abigail's prepared a gift, gives it to a servant and sends the servant out in advance. Where have you heard that before? There was a man way back in Genesis who had a problem with his brother. And Jacob insulted Esau, who said, I'm going to kill Jacob. Jacob was now rich, and he sends messengers to Esau and finds that Esau's coming after him with 400 men. Jacob is utterly petrified because he knows he is no match for his brother. Jacob prays for deliverance and then takes a present for Esau and sends the present out in front with servants, one course after another with his servants, and he brings up the rear with the children. He meets Esau and he bows to the ground, and Esau, of all people, accepts the gift, and they part, well, I want to say friends, but they part at least on good terms. Well, there's the parallel. And you can see in that parallel where David fits. Can't you? David is doing exactly what Esau would do. Esau, it tells us in Hebrews 12 verse 16, was a profane man, a profane and fornicating man. David is a man after God's own heart, but anything but in this chapter. Well, it tells us in verse 20 that was so that when Abigail rode on the ass, that she came down by the covert of the hill, and behold, David and his men came down against her, and she met them. The word covert means a ravine. So she's riding her ass under the cover of a hill. And all of a sudden, over the top of the hill comes David and meets her. Now you think about that. What are the chances? She's going to meet David. He's coming to Nabal's house. And they're on the same route, and she happens to meet David. She didn't know exactly which way David would come, or precisely, I suppose, where he was coming from. She takes the most direct route and they run into each other. It could only be providence, I suppose, that she meets David on the way. That's certainly how she sees it. And David's caught off guard. He catches his breath when he sees her, and she makes the most of it. Verse 23, when Abigail saw David, she hasted. She lighted off the ash. She fell down before David on her face and bowed herself to the ground. And you can imagine David's great convoy grinding to a halt. And David stops, and everybody stops behind him, and there'll be urgent whispers then from the back, who couldn't see what was happening up the front, who couldn't hear the conversation that was going to take place. What's up? What's up? What's up? What's up? What's up? A woman. What does she want? What does she want? What does she want? Don't know. What are they doing? Like this. You can imagine this. Hey, these are 400 men who thought they were going to shed blood today. Who was it? Nabal's wife. So everybody's starting to draw their own conclusions from this. A remarkably courageous thing to do, what she's doing here, isn't it? Even Joab's head would turn at this, I think. She fell at his feet, verse 24, and said, "Upon me, my Lord, upon me let this iniquity be. Let thine handmaid, I pray thee, speak in thine audience and hear the words of thine handmaid. My Lord." 14 times in this chapter she calls David Lord. This is the beginning of her great plea. And the first point she makes here is it's all her fault. If you want to blame somebody, blame me. You want to punish somebody, punish me, she says. You know, one of the commentaries I read when I first looked at the subject suggested that she gets by using all her womanly charm with David. That she takes the responsibility and she puts David in the position, therefore, of killing a beautiful and defenceless woman. Well, all I can say to that interpretation is that if that was the case, we've degraded both her and David beyond measure. I don't believe that would have frankly impressed David one bit. He is livid with the answer that's come back. The fact that Nabal's wife would come and plead for Nabal would not, of itself, I don't believe, make any shred of a difference to David whatsoever. And if it was left to David's men, they might well have killed her as well, because they did plan to execute the entire household. David would be more likely to think that Nabal had put her up to it, in which case even he might take her life. No, if that's all there was to it, I think that would backfire terribly. Her success in this matter is based completely upon her appreciation of the Bible. Look at verse 25. Let not my Lord, I pray thee, regard this man of Belial, even Nabal, for as his name is, so is he. Nabal is his name, and folly is with him. But I, thine handmaid, saw not the young men of my Lord whom thou didst send. My husband's a fool, she said. Of course, this is a play on his name. The Hebrew is poetic. Fool is his name and folly is with him. That's like saying Brutus is his name and he is a brute. I didn't see the young men. So now she tells David why he should blame her. She wasn't keeping an eye on her husband. I mean, he needs watching 24/7. He's prone to these outbursts, you see. And she's obviously in the practice of running the household and keeping him happy in his own little world, counting coins on the desk, and she takes care of all the serious business of life. No doubt at this time she was busy organising the festivities of sheep shearing. She's got more than enough things to do. Late nights, early mornings, shuttling back and forth between Maon and Carmel, and this falls through the cracks, and she wasn't there to answer the door when David's men came. Well, it's my fault, she says. I should have thought more about that. And now the real strength of her argument emerges. Verse 26. Now therefore, my Lord, As Yahweh liveth, and as thy soul liveth, seeing Yahweh hath withholden thee from coming to shed blood, and from avenging thyself with thine own hand, now let thine enemies and they that seek evil to my Lord be as Nabal. Yahweh's withholden thee. Now, actually nothing's happened. All that's happened is that David has stopped on the path with 400 angry men behind him. But she's saying that this meeting's providential. Yahweh has withheld it. That's immediately how she interprets this meeting. You've got enemies, David. Up until now, you've never avenged yourself on any of them because you know that vengeance is God's. David, I've also got an enemy. I'm married to him. But he's not your enemy, David. He'll never attack you. He's just a fool. And God will deal with him like he deals with all fools in his time. Proverbs 26 verse 10, the great God that formeth all things, both rewardeth the fool and rewardeth transgressors. Yahweh shall deal with him in due course. It's in God's hand, David. And may all your enemies be as weak a threat to you as Nabal is. But that'll depend on God and not on you, David. And David would think about that later, you know. Nabal is Saul. Saul is Nabal. I wouldn't touch Saul, but I would touch Nabal. And on what basis would this double standard occur in my life? Only because I'm not as faithful to the commandments in my consistency as I ought to be. How come Saul hasn't ever caught up with me yet? Only because God stopped him. And perhaps if I'd killed Nabal, who really was completely defenseless, then God might let Saul get me too, and Saul could kill me. I could kill the Nabal who's defenseless and find myself face to face with the other Nabal who's really not so defenseless. In verse 27, she asks them to accept the present she brings. And in verse 28, she says, I pray thee, forgive the trespass of thine handmaid, for Yahweh will certainly make my Lord a sure house, because my Lord fighteth the battles of Yahweh, and evil hath not been found in thee all thy days. God will make you a sure house. Unbelievable. That chapter of the Bible hasn't even been written yet. It's 2 Samuel chapter 7 in the promises to David, where David finds out from God that God will make him a sure house. She already says it here. David doesn't even yet know himself that he's going to be made a sure house. You see where this is leading? She's not doing this for her house. She's not on the ground in front of David for the protection of her house. She's doing it for the protection of his house, and for the throne, and for his reputation, and for his ability to govern the country in the future. And that if he kills Nabal on this day, he'll regret it for the rest of his life, and the nation won't forget it. What about your house, David? Because you fight the battles of Yahweh. Everybody knows it, and up until now you've been blameless. You've been faultless. Don't ruin it. Don't blot your copybook. And look at these words, verse 29. Yet a man is risen to pursue thee and to seek thy soul, but the soul of my Lord shall be bound in the bundle of life with Yahweh thy God, and the souls of thine enemies, them he shall sling out as of the middle of a sling. Now, where has that language come from? Well, there's no doubt. Am I a dog? Said Goliath to David. Caleb, Nabal's ancestor, means dog. Goliath disdained David as Nabal did. God will sling all David's enemies out of the sling, as he did on the battlefield of Elah. David's life is in the bundle or the pouch or the bag. It's the same thing as what David took those 5 stones in on the battlefield of Elah. David fights God's battles historically on the battle of Elah, and she's saying he ought to here as well. Nabal, well, how about that? Nabal's killed by a stone, isn't he? His heart stopped like a stone, it says in verse 37 of this chapter. And wickedness returns upon Nabal's own head, exactly as it did metaphorically with Goliath. And the consequence of the whole transaction in the battlefield of Elah was that David receives a wife, the daughter of Saul, as he does here. Remarkable. What's the point? Jonathan wasn't the only one that was mightily impressed with David's conduct on the battlefield of Elah when he killed Goliath. He wasn't the only one that heard what David said down there on the battlefield. Now, Abigail might not have personally been there, but what David said that day before that transaction occurred would have gone like wildfire around the faithful of the country. All Joab saw was a stone fly through the air. What Jonathan heard was a marvellous confession of faith. And this woman is exactly the same. You want the female counterpart of Jonathan in the life of David? You've got her right here, precisely in this woman. Well, verse 30. And it will come to pass, she says, when Yahweh shall have done to my Lord according to all that he hath spoken concerning thee, and shall have appointed thee ruler over Israel, that this shall be no grief unto thee. If you do nothing, no grief will come to you, she says, nor offence of heart unto my Lord, either that thou hast shed blood causeless, or that my Lord has avenged himself. But when Yahweh shall have dealt well with my Lord, then remember thine handmaid, she says. And if you turn around and go home and God blesses you, then remember me when God deals with the problem I've got in my life, she says. So you see her argument. God has providentially intervened in this matter between you and me. It's my fault. I should have been watching my husband, she says, more closely. Please accept this gift. And as for you, God's going to make you a sure house. You're going to be king over Israel. You're going to destroy all your enemies. It all began in the valley of Elah. We all know about that, David. Everything God has spoken concerning you will happen just as he said. Don't ruin it now. Astounding. Absolutely astounding. Another commentator I read suggested that her knowledge was so great and her faith so mature that she must have had contact with the schools of the prophets. Well, that might very well be so. But look how she concludes in verse 31, the end of verse 31. And when Yahweh has dealt well with my Lord, then remember thine handmaid. Do you know, that is exactly what Jonathan said in chapter 20 and verse 15. When Yahweh has cut off all your enemies, David, then remember me, he says. Well, what can David say? He's rebuked, he's encouraged, he's humbled, he's just received one of the greatest and most illuminating exhortations of his entire lifetime, and the soft word has turned away wrath. And verse 32 says that David said to Abigail, blessed be Yahweh God of Israel, which sent thee this day to meet me. He's personally honest. And despite how this looked in front of 400 men, there's the greatness of David. Righto, fellas, let's go home. Let's go home. We're done here. And so they did. Personal honesty from David. He committed the sins, but at the end of the day, he was an honest man and honest with himself. And let me tell you, if we're going to overcome sin, any of us, any sin in our lives, it all begins with personal honesty. If we're not honest with ourselves, it stops there. He was honest, personally. Proverbs 9 verse 9. Give instruction to a wise man, and he will be yet wiser. Teach a just man, and he will increase in his learning. But Abigail's job's not done yet. Verse 36. Abigail came to Nabal, so she goes home as well. Comes to Nabal, and behold, he held a feast in his house, like the feast of a king. And Nabal's heart was merry within him, and he was very drunken. Wherefore she told him nothing more or less until the morning light. Of course, he's incoherent. She can't speak to him. So she gets home, and he's inebriated. Probably been drinking for most of the day, so that even if he was able to have defended himself against David, he would have been in no condition to have done so if the soldiers had come to the door. And he's having the feast of a king, it tells us in verse 36. Look at that. David asked if he could spare something. He asks this man if he could spare something. He was a man that feasted like a king and rejected the legitimate request of the future king. And here's King's son Sim eating and drinking, for tomorrow he dies. Isn't it? Verse 37. It came to pass in the morning, when the wine was gone out of Nabal, and his wife had told him these things, that his heart died within him, and he became as a stone. And it came to pass about 10 days after that Yahweh smote Nabal, that he died. He had a stroke, didn't he? Went into a coma, never revived. And Jesus picks up the story in Luke chapter 12 and verse 19, the parable of the rich fool. Soul, thou hast much goods laid up for many years. Take thine ease, eat, drink, and be merry. Relax, soul. You've worked hard, soul. You deserve this, soul. Treat yourself, soul. Have pity on yourself, soul. Jesus said, you've got to love Yahweh with your heart, soul, mind, and strength. Jesus himself poured out his soul unto death. But God says to the man of the parable, this day thy soul shall be required of thee. The solution Jesus gives to that problem is lay up treasure in heaven. Don't lay it up on earth. It'll kill you. Well, the news comes to David, of course. The picture's now completed. Verse 32, blessed be Yahweh, he says, for sending Abigail. Verse 33, blessed be Abigail for restraining me. Verse 39, blessed be Yahweh for his justice. Proverbs 20 and verse 22, say not thou, I will recompense evil, but wait on Yahweh and he will save thee. It's exactly what's happened. And so the inevitable occurs, doesn't it, in verse 40. When the servants of David were come to Abigail to Carmel, they spake to her, saying, David sent us unto thee to take thee to him to wife. So David now asks Abigail to marry him. And of course, in verse 41, she accepts the invitation, but her acceptance wasn't without a certain degree of sacrifice. Think about this. What is she marrying here? In Nabal's house, she had security. She had a good income. She had everything money could buy and servants to run after her. She's going to forsake the treasures of sin for a season and go and marry a fugitive running around in the desert, sleeping in caves, isn't she? To suffer affliction, as it were, with the people of God. She gave it all away. She gave it all away. Verse 44 tells us that Saul, in the meantime, had given David's first wife, Michal, his daughter, to Phalti, the son of Laish, which was at Galim. This is the girl, remember, in Michal, who could never leave the baubles of office, could she? She could never leave the accoutrements of the house of Saul, who loved the luxury that fame and fortune brought her and wouldn't even set a foot into the wilderness to follow David. So you've got two women from wealthy backgrounds. One has no problem leaving it behind and marrying David. The other woman has an enormous problem. She was happy to send David down the wall on the end of a piece of rope and then lie to her father, which further imperiled David's life. Very different girls, these two. Very, very different girls. Well, I'll show you how it ends. They have a son, David and Abigail. They have a son. And you read of that in 2 Samuel chapter 3. Unto David sons born in Hebron. And his firstborn was Amnon of Ahinoam the Jezreelitess. And his second, Chileab of Abigail, the wife of Nabal the Carmelite. The third, Absalom the son of Maacah, the daughter of Talmai, king of Geshur. And so they have a son. But here's the thing. What do they call the son? Chileab. Your margin says Daniel in that reference. But Chileab is what's in the text. Why'd they call him Chileab? Does anybody know what Chileab means? Has anybody got that written in their margin? What Chileab means in 2 Samuel chapter 3 and verse 3. If you don't, you might like to write it in. And I'll prove this to you. Strong's number 3609. So there's my reference. The meaning of Chiliad: the restraint of my father. What do you think of that? The restraint of my father. And in that boy, who goes nowhere in the record, it appears, never finds himself in the king's court later on, but in that boy, the whole transaction of 1 Samuel 25 is memorialised. An unbelievable story, an unbelievable woman, but certainly a woman of enormous virtue.